The clock showed exactly 6:30 when David stepped through the back entrance of Romano's restaurant. He hung his jacket in the staff room and straightened his black tie. 28 years old and still working as a waiter, but he never let that thought bring him down. Every job had dignity if you did it right. Romano's wasn't just any restaurant. Located in the heart of downtown, it attracted the kind of customers who thought nothing of spending $300 on dinner. The white tablecloths gleamed under soft lighting, and fresh flowers sat on every table. David had been working here for 3 years now, and he knew every corner of the place like his own home. He grabbed his notepad and pen, checking his appearance one last time in the mirror by the staff lockers. His white shirt was pressed perfectly, his shoes polished to a shine. Presentation mattered in this business, especially when you looked like him. Some customers made assumptions the moment they saw his face, but David had learned to handle that with patience and professionalism. The dinner rush was about to begin. David walked onto the restaurant floor, greeting his fellow servers with quiet nods. The place buzzed with that familiar energy that came before a busy evening. Servers rushed between tables. The kitchen staff called out orders, and the soft jazz music played in the background. David's section tonight included 6 tables near the large windows overlooking the city. He preferred this area because the natural light made everything feel more welcoming. Plus, the view of the city lights at night often put customers in good moods, which usually meant better tips. His first table of the evening was a young couple celebrating their anniversary. They were nervous and excited, clearly not used to dining somewhere this fancy. David made sure to explain the menu thoroughly and helped them choose a wine that fit their budget. When they thanked him for making their special night even better, he felt that familiar warm feeling that reminded him why he loved this work. The second table was a business dinner between 2 lawyers discussing a case. They barely looked up when he took their order, too absorbed in their conversation about some complicated legal matter. David listened with interest as he served their appetizers. He understood more of their discussion than they might expect. By 8 o'clock, Romano's was packed. Every table in David's section was full, and he moved smoothly between them, keeping water glasses filled and checking that everyone had what they needed. This was his favorite part of the job, when everything flowed like a well-choreographed dance. Then the hostess, Patricia, approached him with that look on her face. The one that meant trouble was walking through the front door. "David, I've got a party of 4 for table 12, she said quietly. Well, just be prepared. Table 12 was right in the center of his section. David looked over and saw 4 people being seated. They were clearly tourists, probably from somewhere up north based on their accents that carried across the restaurant. The men wore expensive suits and the women had jewelry that caught the light from across the room. Everything about them screamed money and attitude. The man who seemed to be leading the group was tall and broad, probably in his 50s. His gray hair was perfectly styled, and his suit probably cost more than David made in a month. He looked around the restaurant like he owned the place, pointing at different things and making comments to his companions that made them laugh. David took a deep breath and walked over to their table. He'd handled difficult customers before. The key was to stay calm, be professional, and focus on providing excellent service no matter how they treated him. "Good evening and welcome to Romano's," David said with his warmest smile. "My name is David and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with something to drink?" The gray-haired man looked up at David slowly, his eyes moving from David's face down to his uniform and back up again. There was something in that look that made David's stomach tighten slightly, but he kept his smile in place. Well, the man said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Look what we have here, folks. I guess they'll hire anyone these days." The other 3 people at the table chuckled and David felt his cheeks grow warm. But he'd been through this before. He knew how to handle it. "I'd be happy to tell you about our wine selection tonight," David continued, his voice steady. "We have an excellent Cabernet from Napa Valley that pairs beautifully with our steaks." The woman sitting across from the gray-haired man leaned forward with a smirk. "Honey, do you really think he knows anything about wine? I mean, look at him." David's smile never wavered, though inside he felt that familiar sting. He'd worked hard to learn about wines, spending his own money on courses and tastings. He probably knew more about the restaurant's wine list than most of the customers who ordered from it. "I'd be happy to bring our sommelier over if you'd prefer," David offered politely. No. The gray-haired man waved his hand dismissively. I'm sure you can handle bringing us some drinks. That's about your speed, right? The table erupted in laughter again, and David noticed that other diners were starting to stare. He felt sorry for those other customers who were just trying to enjoy their meals. This kind of behavior affected everyone's experience. What can I bring you to drink? David asked again, keeping his voice professional. They finally gave him their drink orders, making sure to speak slowly and loudly, as if he might not understand them. David wrote everything down carefully and headed to the bar, his mind already working on how to handle the situation. At the bar, Tony the bartender gave him a sympathetic look. Rough table? He asked quietly. I've had worse, David replied, though he wasn't sure that was true. There was something especially cruel about this group that went beyond the usual rudeness he sometimes encountered. As Tony prepared the drinks, David watched his table from across the restaurant. They were talking animatedly, clearly enjoying themselves at his expense. The gray-haired man was gesturing broadly, probably telling some story that painted David as the punchline. David had learned long ago that some people needed to put others down to feel important. It said more about them than it did about him, but knowing that didn't make it hurt less when it happened. He picked up the drink tray and walked back to table 12, ready for whatever they might throw at him next. After all, he had a job to do, and he was going to do it well regardless of how they treated him. That's what separated him from people like them. He understood what dignity really meant. David returned to table 12 with their drinks balanced perfectly on his tray. He'd been carrying trays for 3 years without dropping so much as a napkin, but as he approached their table, the gray-haired man stuck his foot out slightly into the walkway. Careful there, sport, the man said with a grin as David had to step around the extended leg. Wouldn't want you to trip and make a mess. David set down each drink with practiced precision, making sure not to let his hands shake even though anger was building in his chest. The woman in the red dress picked up her wine glass and held it up to the light. This better not be some cheap house wine, she said loudly. I specifically asked for something good. That's our reserve Pinot Noir from Oregon, David explained calmly. It's $45 a glass and has won several awards. The gray-haired man laughed harshly.
$45?
For wine recommended by him? I bet he drinks beer from a can at home. The entire table burst into laughter, and David noticed that the business lawyers at the next table had stopped their conversation to listen. An elderly couple 2 tables over looked uncomfortable and kept glancing in their direction. Are you ready to order your appetizers? David asked, trying to redirect the conversation to business. Hold on there, boy, the gray-haired man said, and David flinched at the word. We're not ready yet. Why don't you go find something else to do and come back when we call you? David nodded and moved away from their table, but he could still hear their conversation clearly. They weren't even trying to lower their voices. Can you believe they put him in charge of our table? The second man said. He was younger, maybe in his 30s, with slicked back hair and a gold watch that caught the restaurant's soft lighting. I mean, what's next? Are they going to let him cook our food too? Probably learned everything he knows about fine dining from watching movies. The red dress woman added. I bet he's never even been in a place like this as a customer. What they didn't know was that David had actually eaten at Romano's twice as a customer, once for his birthday last year, and once when his sister graduated from college. He'd saved up for weeks both times, but he'd wanted to experience the restaurant from the other side. It had helped him become a better server, understanding what customers really wanted from their dining experience. David checked on his other tables, refilling water glasses and taking new orders. The young anniversary couple asked if everything was okay, having noticed the commotion at table 12. David assured them everything was fine and brought them their dessert with a small candle, just like they'd requested. When he returned to table 12, they were ready to order. The gray-haired man, who seemed to be named Robert based on what the others called him, ordered the most expensive steak on the menu, but he made the process as difficult as possible. I want that steak cooked medium rare, but not too rare, you understand? Robert said slowly, as if talking to a child. That means pink in the middle, but not red. Do you think you can remember that, or should I write it down for you? Medium rare, pink but not red, David repeated. Would you like any sauce with that? Just bring me the steak sauce, Robert said dismissively. Though I doubt you have anything decent. David wanted to explain that they had a house-made herb butter and a red wine reduction that were both exceptional, But he could tell Robert wasn't interested in his recommendations. The man had already decided that David didn't know anything worth hearing. The rest of the table ordered their meals with similar condescending attitudes. They asked him to repeat things multiple times, claimed they couldn't understand his accent, even though David had lived in this city his entire life, and made jokes about whether he could handle taking their orders correctly. As David walked to the kitchen to place their order, he passed Patricia, the hostess. She grabbed his arm gently. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "I can ask Michael to take over that table if you want." Michael was the other server on duty tonight, a white guy about David's age who'd started working at Romano's 6 months ago. David appreciated Patricia's offer, but he shook his head. "I can handle it," he said quietly. "They're just having fun at my expense. It'll be over soon," but it wasn't over soon. When David brought their appetizers, Robert claimed his shrimp cocktail didn't look fresh and demanded a new one. David knew the shrimp had been delivered that morning and was perfectly fine, but he brought a replacement without argument. The woman in the red dress, who the others called Linda, said her salad had too much dressing and made David bring her a new one. Then she complained that the second salad didn't have enough dressing. When David offered to bring dressing on the side, she rolled her eyes and said she shouldn't have to fix her own salad. The worst part was how they treated the rest of the restaurant staff. When the busboy, a shy teenager named Carlos, came to clear their appetizer plates, Robert deliberately knocked over his water glass. "Oops," Robert said with fake concern as water spread across the white tablecloth. "Looks like someone's going to have to clean that up." Carlos quickly mopped up the spill and brought a fresh tablecloth, but Robert made comments about incompetent staff the entire time. David watched the teenager's face turn red with embarrassment and felt his own anger growing stronger. When their main courses arrived, the real torture began. Robert cut into his steak and immediately called David over. "This is not medium rare," Robert announced loudly, holding up a piece of perfectly cooked beef. "This is practically raw. Do you people not know how to cook?" David looked at the steak. It was exactly medium rare, with a perfect pink center just as Robert had ordered, but he knew arguing would only make things worse. "I'll have the kitchen prepare a new one immediately," David said. "Make sure they cook it right this time," Robert said, "and tell them it needs to be hot when it gets here. I shouldn't have to send my food back because your kitchen doesn't know what they're doing." David took the plate back to the kitchen, where the head chef Giuseppe looked at the returned steak in confusion. "What's wrong with this?" Giuseppe asked. "It's perfect medium rare." "I know," David said quietly. "Just cook him a new one exactly the same way." Giuseppe shook his head in frustration but started preparing a replacement. David knew the chef took pride in his work, and returning a perfectly cooked steak was insulting to him too. While waiting for the new steak, David watched Table 12 from the kitchen doorway. They were having the time of their lives, laughing and pointing in his direction. Linda was doing an exaggerated impression of how David walked, swaying her hips and putting on a fake smile. The others found this hilarious. At nearby tables, other customers were clearly uncomfortable. The elderly couple had asked to move to a different section, and the anniversary couple kept glancing over with worried expressions. David realized that this group wasn't just ruining his night. They were affecting everyone else's experience too. When he brought the second steak, which was identical to the first, Robert made a big show of cutting into it and tasting it. "Much better," he declared loudly. "See what happens when you actually try?" The rest of the meal continued in the same pattern. Every interaction was designed to humiliate David and make him feel small. They complained about the temperature of their food, the speed of service, and even the music playing in the background, as if David was personally responsible for every aspect of their experience. But David endured it all with quiet dignity, never losing his temper or giving them the reaction they seemed to want. He continued to smile, to say "yes, sir," and "right away, ma'am," and to provide the professional service that Romano's was known for. What Robert and his friends didn't realize was that their behavior was revealing much more about themselves than they intended, and David was paying attention to every word they said. During his 15-minute break, David walked to the staff room behind the kitchen. His hands were shaking slightly as he sat down on the old couch where the servers took their breaks. He'd dealt with rude customers before, but tonight felt different. The cruelty was more personal, more deliberate. Giuseppe poked his head into the break room. The chef was a kind man in his 60s who had worked at Romano's for over 20 years. He'd seen every type of customer come and go. "You okay, David?" Giuseppe asked in his thick Italian accent. "Those people at table 12, they are not good people." David managed a weak smile. "I'm fine, Giuseppe. Just need a few minutes." "You know," Giuseppe said, sitting down next to him, "in all my years here I have learned something important. The way people treat waiters, it tells you everything about who they really are. Those people, they have ugly hearts." David nodded, grateful for the support. Giuseppe was right, but that didn't make it easier to endure their behavior. David pulled out his phone to check the time and saw a text message from his study group. They were meeting tomorrow night to review for their upcoming exam. That reminder gave David strength. His coworkers saw him as just a waiter, and that was fine. But there was so much more to his story that people like Robert could never imagine. 3 years ago, David had enrolled in law school. Not the big fancy university downtown, but the smaller evening program at State University. Classes were held at night so that working people could attend. It wasn't prestigious, but it was accredited, and it was what David could afford while working full-time. For 3 years, David had worked at Romano's during the dinner shift, then rushed to campus for classes that ran from 9 p.m. until midnight. He studied in the break room during slow periods, read case law while riding the bus home, and wrote papers on his laptop in his small apartment. Last month, David had taken the bar exam. The results wouldn't come back for another 6 weeks, but his professors were confident he'd pass. He'd graduated third in his class despite working 40 hours a week the entire time. David's area of focus was employment law and civil rights. He'd written his senior thesis on workplace discrimination and had spent countless hours studying cases about people who'd been treated unfairly because of their race, gender, or background. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was experiencing exactly the kind of behavior he'd spent years learning how to fight in court. But David had a rule about keeping his two worlds separate. At the restaurant, he was just David the waiter. His coworkers knew he was in school, but most customers had no idea about his education. He'd learned that some people treated servers differently when they found out about college degrees, and David preferred to be judged on his service alone. Tonight, however, he was starting to question that rule. David returned to the dining room refreshed and ready to finish his shift. Table 12 was on their third round of drinks now, and their voices were getting louder. As he approached to check if they needed anything, he couldn't help but overhear their conversation. Robert was telling a story about his construction company, and David's trained legal mind immediately picked up on several concerning details. "So we're working on this government contract," Robert was saying, gesturing broadly with his wine glass. "Federal highway project. Supposed to use specific grade materials. But here's the thing. Nobody actually checks what you use once you submit the paperwork." Linda leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Robert continued, lowering his voice slightly but not enough that David couldn't hear from a few feet away, "we order the cheap stuff from overseas. Costs half as much, looks exactly the same. The government inspectors never know the difference." The younger man, who David had heard called Brad, whistled appreciatively. "How much are you saving?" "On this project alone?" "About $2 million, Robert said proudly. "Been doing it for years on different jobs. The beauty is, these highway projects last decades. By the time anyone notices problems with the materials, if they ever do, everyone involved in the original construction is long gone." David felt his blood run cold. Robert wasn't just talking about cutting corners or being lazy. He was describing federal contract fraud, the kind that endangered public safety. Those highways would carry thousands of cars every day. Families with children would drive over bridges built with substandard materials. As a law student specializing in civil rights and employment issues, David had studied enough criminal law to recognize several serious felonies being discussed casually over expensive wine. "The best part," Robert continued, "is that we've got connections with the inspection company. My brother-in-law works there. He makes sure our projects get the rubber stamp treatment." Now Robert was admitting to conspiracy and bribery on top of the fraud. David's mind raced through the federal statutes he'd memorized for his criminal law class. Robert was looking at decades in prison if these allegations could be proven. David moved closer, pretending to refill their water glasses while listening carefully. His phone was in his pocket, and he wondered if he should try to record this conversation. But he was nervous about the legal implications of recording someone without their consent, even in a public place. "You're brilliant, Robert," the fourth member of their group said. She was older, maybe Robert's wife, with expensive jewelry and a fur coat draped over her chair. "No wonder the company's doing so well." "It's all about knowing how to work the system," Robert replied. "These government bureaucrats are so focused on paperwork, they never look at the actual work being done. As long as you file the right forms and know the right people, you can get away with anything." David's hands were steady now as he continued his work, but his mind was spinning. He thought about all the legal ethics classes he'd taken, all the discussions about lawyers' responsibilities to society. Here was someone openly admitting to crimes that could hurt innocent people, and David was in a unique position to do something about it. But he was also just a waiter trying to get through his shift. If he confronted these people now, it would be his word against theirs. They were wealthy, well-connected, and clearly experienced at avoiding consequences for their actions. David was a server in a restaurant who these people had already decided didn't matter. As the evening progressed, Robert and his friends continued to drink and talk. Their conversation revealed more details about their illegal activities. Robert mentioned specific projects, dates, and amounts of money involved. He named government officials who'd been bribed and described methods for hiding the paperwork trail. David realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. White-collar criminals usually went to great lengths to hide their activities, but Robert was so confident in his ability to avoid consequences that he was practically confessing to federal crimes in a public restaurant. The question was, what David should do with this information. As someone who'd studied law for 3 years, he understood the potential impact of what he was hearing. But as someone who'd been humiliated and degraded by these same people all evening, he also understood the personal cost of getting involved. When David brought their dessert menus, Robert looked up at him with the same condescending expression he'd worn all night. "Tell me something, boy," Robert said, using that word again that made David's jaw tighten. "What do you think you'll be doing in 10 years? Still bringing people their food?" The table laughed, waiting for David's response. They expected him to be embarrassed, to stammer some excuse about his life circumstances, to confirm their belief that he was beneath them. David looked at Robert calmly, his mind clear for the first time all evening. "I think," David said quietly, "that in 10 years I'll be exactly where I'm supposed to be." It wasn't the answer they expected, and something in David's tone made Robert study his face more carefully. "Well," Robert said uncertainly, "I guess we'll see about that." David smiled and walked away, leaving them to wonder what he'd meant. They had no idea that they'd just revealed their crimes to someone who understood exactly what to do with that information. The evening was about to take a very different turn. David walked calmly to the service station near the kitchen, his mind working through everything he'd heard. 3 years of law school had taught him to think systematically about evidence, and what Robert had just confessed to was a prosecutor's dream case. He pulled out his phone and quickly opened the voice recording app. Then he returned to table 12 with their dessert menus, positioning himself where he could capture their continuing conversation clearly. "So the highway project in Springfield," Brad was asking Robert, "that's the one where you use the Chinese steel instead of the American grade?" "Exactly," Robert replied loudly, the wine clearly affecting his judgment. "Saved us $800,000 on that job alone. The specs called for American steel with specific stress ratings, but the Chinese stuff looks identical once it's installed." David's phone was recording every word. Robert was providing specific details about which projects involved fraud, how much money was saved, and exactly how they circumvented federal safety requirements. "What about the bridge project upstate?" Linda asked. "The one where your brother-in-law expedited the inspection?" "That was beautiful," Robert laughed. "Supposed to take 6 weeks for a full structural inspection. Tommy had it approved in 3 days without even visiting the site. Cost me $20,000 in cash, but I saved $2 million in delays and rework." David had enough evidence now to destroy Robert's company and send multiple people to federal prison. But he wasn't finished. These people had spent the entire evening treating him like he was worthless, and now they were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. When they finished ordering dessert, David approached their table with a different demeanor entirely. The nervous energy was gone, replaced by calm confidence. "Excuse me," David said in a clear, professional voice that carried across the nearby tables. "I apologize for interrupting, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding this evening." Robert looked up with irritation. "What kind of misunderstanding? And make it quick, we're trying to have a private conversation here." "Well," David said, pulling out his phone and setting it on their table, "I don't think our conversation has been as private as you thought." The red recording light was clearly visible, and the table fell silent as they realized what they were looking at. "You see," David continued, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned in 3 years of law school, "my name is David Thompson. I'm a recent graduate of State University Law School, where I finished third in my class while working full-time to pay my tuition." The color drained from Robert's face. "You're what?" "I passed the bar exam 3 weeks ago," David said calmly. "The results aren't back yet, but my professors are confident I'll be practicing law very soon. My specialty is employment discrimination and civil rights, but I did take several criminal law courses." Linda's hand went to her throat. "You've been recording us?" "For the past 20 minutes, yes," David confirmed. "During which time Mr. Robert Chambers of Chambers Construction has confessed to multiple counts of federal contract fraud, conspiracy to defraud the government, bribery of federal officials, and conspiracy to commit bribery." The silence at table 12 was deafening. Brad's face had gone completely white, and Robert's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Based on what I've recorded tonight," David continued, "Mr. Chambers has described specific instances of using substandard materials on federal highway projects, bribing government inspectors, and conspiring with his brother-in-law to falsify safety inspections. These activities have endangered public safety and defrauded taxpayers of millions of dollars." Other diners in the restaurant had stopped eating to listen. The anniversary couple was staring in amazement, and the business lawyers at the next table were leaning forward with professional interest. "Now," David said, his voice remaining perfectly calm, "I have a choice to make. As someone who will soon be an officer of the court, I have certain ethical obligations when I become aware of ongoing criminal activity. I could simply forward this recording to the FBI's white-collar crime division, along with a detailed summary of everything I witnessed tonight." Robert found his voice finally. "You can't. That recording isn't legal. You can't record people without permission." David smiled for the first time all evening, and it wasn't the submissive smile he'd been forced to wear as their waiter. This was the confident smile of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. "Actually, Mr. Chambers, this is a one-party consent state. That means as long as one person in the conversation knows it's being recorded, it's completely legal. Since I was present during your admissions and consented to the recording, everything on this phone is admissible evidence." The legal accuracy of David's statement hit the table like a physical blow. These weren't just empty threats from an angry waiter. This was a law school graduate who understood exactly how to use what he'd learned. "But," David continued, "I'm willing to consider an alternative arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Robert asked desperately. "First," David said, counting on his fingers, "you will apologize sincerely to every member of the staff you've insulted tonight. Not just to me, but to Carlos the busboy, Giuseppe the chef, Patricia the hostess, and Tony the bartender. You will look them in the eye and acknowledge that your behavior was unacceptable." The table exchanged glances, clearly not happy with this requirement, but having little choice. "Second," David continued, "you will make a substantial donation to the scholarship fund at State University Law School. Let's say $50,000. That money will help other working students afford their education without having to endure the kind of treatment you've put me through tonight." Robert's face was red now, whether from anger or embarrassment. David couldn't tell. "And third," David said, his voice becoming more serious, "you will immediately cease all fraudulent activities on your government contracts. I want written documentation within 30 days that Chambers Construction is using only approved materials and following all federal safety requirements." "And if we do all this?" Linda asked quietly. "Then I'll consider whether the public interest would be better served by allowing you to correct your behavior voluntarily, or by turning this evidence over to federal prosecutors," David replied. "But understand this clearly, I'll be watching. If I hear about any future violations or if you fail to meet any of these conditions, this recording goes straight to the FBI." Brad leaned forward, How do we know you won't turn us in anyway? David looked at him with something approaching pity. Because unlike you, I actually believe in justice. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about making things right. If you're willing to make things right, then we can move forward. If you're not... He let the sentence hang in the air, the threat clear. Robert was quiet for a long moment, calculating his options. Finally, he spoke in a voice much smaller than the one he'd been using all evening. How do we know you're really a lawyer? This could all be some kind of scam. David reached into his wallet and pulled out his state university student ID, his bar exam admission ticket, and a business card from the law firm where he'd done his internship. You're welcome to verify any of this information, David said. My professor, Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, would be happy to confirm my academic record. The Bar Association can verify that I took the exam, and if you'd like to test my legal knowledge, I'd be happy to discuss the specific federal statutes you violated tonight. The fight went out of Robert completely. He realized he wasn't dealing with someone he could intimidate or dismiss. This was someone who could destroy his life with a simple phone call. What do you want us to do first? Robert asked quietly. David smiled again, but this time it was the smile of someone who had just won a victory not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been treated like they didn't matter. First, David said, you're going to apologize, and you're going to mean it. What happened next was something David would remember for the rest of his life. Robert Chambers, the man who had spent the entire evening treating David like he was invisible, slowly stood up from his chair. His expensive suit seemed to hang differently on him now, and his confident posture had crumpled into something much smaller. Robert began, then stopped. The words seemed to stick in his throat. Around the restaurant, other diners had stopped pretending not to watch. Even the soft jazz music seemed quieter, as if the whole place was holding its breath. David waited patiently. He'd learned in law school that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply let silence do the work. I owe you an apology, Robert finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. My behavior tonight was inexcusable. You've been nothing but professional, and I treated you with disrespect. David nodded slightly but didn't speak. This was just the beginning. Robert looked around the restaurant, realizing that his humiliation was as public as David's had been. I also need to apologize to your colleagues. Could you ask them to come over? David walked to the kitchen and quietly asked Giuseppe, Carlos, Patricia, and Tony to join him at table 12. They approached cautiously, clearly sensing that something significant had happened but not sure what. When the staff assembled around the table, Robert cleared his throat. His face was flushed and his hands were shaking slightly. I want to apologize to all of you, Robert said, looking at each person individually. My friends and I behaved terribly tonight. We were rude, disrespectful, and completely out of line. You all work hard to provide excellent service, and you deserve to be treated with dignity. Carlos, the young busboy, looked stunned. Giuseppe nodded grimly, his expression suggesting this wasn't enough, but it was a start. Patricia and Tony exchanged glances, clearly wondering what had brought about this sudden change. We're also going to make a substantial donation to help students afford their education, Robert continued. It's the least we can do. Brad, Linda, and the fourth woman remained seated, looking like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. They mumbled their own apologies, clearly following Robert's lead but without much conviction. David thanked the staff members, who returned to their duties with puzzled expressions. Then he sat down across from Robert, his phone still recording. Now, David said quietly, let's talk about your business practices. Over the next 30 minutes, Robert provided details about every fraudulent project his company had undertaken. David took notes, asking specific questions about dates, locations, amounts of money involved, and which government officials had been bribed. His legal training helped him identify the most serious violations and gather the information that would be most useful to prosecutors. The highway project in Springfield, David said, consulting his notes.
How many cars do you estimate use that road every day?
Robert's face went pale. Probably 15,000 vehicles daily, maybe more during rush hour. And the bridge project upstate that your brother-in-law approved without a proper inspection? That's a major connector. Probably 40,000 cars a day plus heavy trucks carrying freight. David let the implications sink in. They weren't just talking about money or abstract government regulations. They were talking about the safety of tens of thousands of people who trusted that the infrastructure they used every day had been built properly. "Do you understand," David said quietly, "that what you've described could result in catastrophic failures? Bridges collapse. Highway surfaces fail. People die." Robert was crying now, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his actions hit him. We always figured the safety margins were so high that cutting a few corners wouldn't matter." "But you didn't know for sure," David pressed. "You gambled with other people's lives to increase your profit margins." The truth of that statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Around them, the restaurant continued to function, but their table existed in its own bubble of consequence and revelation. David spent another hour documenting everything Robert told him. He learned about a network of corrupt contractors, inspectors, and government officials who had been systematically defrauding taxpayers and endangering public safety for years. Robert's company was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. When they finally finished, David had enough evidence to bring down dozens of people and potentially save countless lives by ensuring that infrastructure projects met proper safety standards. "What happens now?" Robert asked. David considered his answer carefully. "Now you go home and think about what kind of person you want to be. Tomorrow you start making this right. You have 30 days to provide me with documentation, showing that all current projects are using proper materials and following safety regulations. And the donation, $50,000 to the State University Law School Scholarship Fund. I'll give you the account information before you leave." Robert nodded miserably. "And after that? After that, we'll see. If you follow through on everything we've discussed, and if you truly change your business practices, then maybe we can consider this a learning experience. But if I hear about any backsliding or if you try to retaliate against me in any way, this recording goes straight to the FBI." David paused, then leaned forward slightly. "And Mr. Chambers?" "Don't think for a second that I won't follow through. You spent tonight treating me like I don't matter, like I'm beneath your notice. But I want you to remember something. The person you tried to humiliate is the same person who now holds your future in his hands." Robert looked up at David with something approaching respect for the first time all evening. How did you stay so calm? If someone treated me the way we treated you?" David thought about that question. "Because I know who I am. You tried to make me feel small, but you can't change the truth about a person just by being cruel to them. I've worked hard for everything I've achieved. I've earned my place in this world through effort and dedication, not by putting other people down." He stood up and straightened his tie, the same gesture he'd made at the beginning of his shift. But now it felt different, like he was putting on armor instead of a uniform. "I hope you learned something from tonight," David said. "Real strength doesn't come from making other people feel powerless. It comes from using whatever power you have to make things better." 3 weeks later, David received a certified letter containing documentation that Chambers Construction had voluntarily reported safety violations to federal authorities and was working with inspectors to ensure all current projects met proper standards. The letter also included a receipt showing that $50,000 had been donated to the State University Law School Scholarship Fund. 6 weeks after that, David received his bar exam results. He had passed with flying colors. On his last day at Romano's, Giuseppe made David a special dinner and the entire staff signed a card congratulating him on his new career. Patricia told him that the story of what happened that night had become legendary among the restaurant workers in the city. "You showed everyone that respect goes both ways," she said. "That just because someone serves your food doesn't mean they're serving you as a person." David opened his own law practice 6 months later, specializing in employment discrimination and workers' rights. His first major case involved a group of construction workers who had been fired for refusing to use substandard materials on a government project. David won a significant settlement for his clients and helped expose another network of corrupt contractors. He kept a copy of the recording from that night at Romano's in his office safe, not because he ever intended to use it again, but as a reminder of an important lesson. Everyone deserves dignity regardless of their circumstances, and sometimes the people you least expect can change your life forever. Years later, when David had become one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys, He would tell young lawyers that justice wasn't just about winning cases or making money. It was about understanding that every person has value, and that sometimes the most important victories happen not in courtrooms, but in moments when you choose to stand up for what's right, even when nobody expects you to have that kind of power. The tourist never came back to Romano's, but David heard through various legal channels that Robert Chambers had indeed changed his business practices and had become an advocate for construction industry reforms. Sometimes, David reflected, people really could learn from their mistakes, but only if someone was brave enough to teach them the lesson they needed to learn.